our speaker, Ms. Roberta Cohen. Ms. Cohen is a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings institution. She specialized in human rights, humanitarian, and refugee issues, and is an expert on the subject of internally displaced persons. She is also co-chair of the Committee for Human Rights in Israel. For more than a decade, she co-directed the Brookings project on internal displacement and served as a senior advisor to the representative of the UN Secretary General on internally displaced persons. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Roberta Cohen.
Good afternoon. It seems to be my fate to address difficult issues at luncheon meetings. So let me thank the Asan Institute for giving me the opportunity to say a few words about accountability for the crimes committed by the Kim regime. This dynasty is now entering its 65th year, and there have been numerous predictions about its collapse and discussions about the challenge of Korean reunification. But only recently has accountability been put on the table in a really serious way. For the first time, as you know, the United Nations Human Rights Council created a commission of inquiry to look into systematic and grave violations with a view to ensuring full accountability where these violations constitute crimes against humanity. I'm not an expert in transitional law, but I would like to share with you some thoughts and experiences, particularly directed toward the most obviously egregious violations, and that is the camps. And I know many will say, oh, we know a lot about the camps, but the world really doesn't know a lot about the camps at all. I would ask, why has it taken so long to address accountability when the gravity of the crimes is so monumental that the High Commissioner for Human Rights said, the UN High Commissioner, that the regime has no parallel anywhere else in the world? Let's look at some of the reasons, since many are still serving to impede accountability. The first is obvious, and that is the secrecy of the Kim regime, which has invested so much resources and energy into concealing its conduct. As Kim Jong-il is reported to have said, it's such a chilling quote, we must envelop our environment in a dense fog to prevent our enemies from learning anything about us. Pervasive internal security controls restrict the flow of information and make sure people do not talk about what they witness. Recently, reports about prisoners being taken from Camp 22 have been reported in the dead of night, in covered trucks, and I was told that people in the area were told not to look out their windows. Now, over the past decade, the information blockade has been eroding with new technology, private markets, and the illegal departures, but there are still significant gaps in information that make accountability difficult. For example, we know rates of detention are high, but do we know the number of political prisoners who have died in the camps? I've heard 400,000, I've heard 100,000. Do we know how they died? Do we know how many children have been born in the camps and spent their lives there? Do we know the fate of those forcibly repatriated from China and imprisoned? Do we know how many public executions have taken place throughout the country? And what about the specifics of the total control zones in the prisons? Human rights non-governmental organizations didn't begin in-depth reporting until the late 1980s. And an organization like the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea was established in 2001, and the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights was established in 2003. The United Nations first appointed a special rapporteur on human rights in North Korea in 2004. So this is 56 years after the Kim regime came to power. What finally made the international community take notice were the horrific testimonies of defectors. Some 25,000 made their way to South Korea over the past 15 years and began telling their stories. Google Earth, Digital Globe began to publish satellite photographs of the camps, which were long denied by the North Korean authorities, but many gaps in information remain. We also don't know the extent to which the North Koreans keep records. A second reason accountability has been slow has been the tendency on the part of governments and United Nations officials to discount the information provided by defectors as not being sound enough to move forward. At the UN, an effort was made over a 10-year period to establish a dialogue with North Korea, which always failed because the North Koreans refused to have a dialogue or let any human rights part of the UN to have entry. And high commissioners espoused the view for many years that it was necessary for the UN itself to assess the situation on the ground in order to form an independent diagnosis. Even the State Department human rights reports regularly point out that the US and North Korea don't have relations, and that no one can assess fully human rights conditions or confirm reported abuses, and that the testimonies of defectors can be dated. Now, these attitudes have begun to change as the testimonies accumulate and they corroborate one another, but there still exists a kind of gold standard of proof that's held up from time to time that international monitors have to be on the ground verifying each and every piece of information in order to arrive at a sound conclusion. And I believe that in the case of North Korea, some allowances must be made. Third, international preoccupation with North Korea's nuclear program has overshadowed attention to the nature of the regime. Strategic and political priorities have generally excluded attention to human rights accountability. The United Nations Forum right now being a welcome exception. But just take a look at the joint declaration of May of President Obama and President Park. It speaks of peaceful reunification based on the principles of denuclearization, democracy, and a free market economy. No reference is made to human rights as a foundation for reunification. Will human rights accountability be dispensable in a highly politicized atmosphere? Soviet nuclear physicist Andrei Sakharov was more prescient. When he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, he warned that international trust, and I repeat international trust, and disarmament are inconceivable without an open society, freedom of information, and fundamental human rights. Fourth, there are fears that have been expressed at this conference that talking about holding North Koreans to account could lead to more repression. To avoid prosecution, North Koreans may try to cover their tracks by killing prisoners, destroying evidence, and the risk exists. And it makes contingency plans necessary so that people can exit the camps safely. Shin Dong-guk has called for a greater international spotlight on the camps to prevent the annihilation of prisoners. Fear also exists that the setting up of domestic courts or turning to international tribunals will impede reconciliation in a unified Korea. But not addressing the issue, at least the most egregious violations, will create more problems. I remember serving in the first Human Rights Bureau in the State Department in the 1970s, when thousands of persons in Argentina were disappearing. The embassy in Buenos Aires cabled in that the Argentine government wanted the U.S. to stop dwelling on the disappearances. And there were U.S. officials that were persuaded by that view that there are good political reasons to move on. And it said, dead is dead. But those directly affected in Argentina and many others couldn't forget and kept demanding an accounting, and they did so year after year, despite amnesties. There was no end to the marches and the appeals. There were the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, as they were called, and trials finally were held as recently as 2010. The disappearances were not going to be forgotten. I might add that I was also in the State Department when the May 18th Gwangju massacre occurred. And there was also viewpoints that, well, this too will pass. And that will be forgotten about when it has not been. And May 18th is a national day in South Korea. And in Bulgaria in the 1990s, I remember people needing to talk after the fall of the Zhivkov regime, especially those who've been incarcerated in prisons and psychiatric hospitals. I was part of a team giving the first human rights lectures in the country, and we could see there was a need for healing, closure, and reconciliation, and the president of the country said something I have never forgotten. He said, before turning the page, you have to read it. Now, reading it in the case of North Korea could mean, as the discussions have taken place at this conference, could mean truth commissions, could mean trials, could mean community-based mechanisms, all of them. It should also mean understanding what happened in terms of the North Korean reality and experience. Former North Korean prisoners like Shin, and also South Korean scholars of the North often visit the Holocaust Museum in Washington, or Auschwitz or Dachau, and use terms emanating from the Holocaust, concentration camps, extermination, even genocide, to describe what happened. Some also point to the Soviet Gulag as a model for the penal labor camps. But North Koreans, I believe, have to begin to identify their own terminology for their horrific experiences. I don't think it should be subsumed under the Holocaust. Sangwon, after all, the discriminatory political caste system at the base of most of the human rights violations in the country, has become an insignia of the Kim regime, drawn from feudal practices. Another insignia is the incarceration of whole families for 3 generations based on guilt by association. Not to speak of forced abortions that are carried out on racial grounds on North Korean women impregnated by Chinese men. Creating a documentation center to compile all the evidence on the Kim regime, its origins, and its practices will not only make it Korea-specific, and that's very important, but will help heal survivors. Recently, I saw a documentary that showed Pyongyang's monuments, which all seem to glorify the Kim dynasty, but missing was a monument to honor the memory of those killed by this dynasty and to educate future generations. Helping North Koreans to heal will also require special programs to address the physical and psychological damage done to the men, women, and children held in the camps, and to those abducted or lured from abroad and held against their will in North Korea. Both prisoners and abductees cannot simply be expected to resume their lives. The HRNK report, Hidden Gulag, documents how prisoners who were officially released from Camp 18 remained in the camp in a special section because they lost connection with their former lives and they really had no place to go. And this was the most awful thing among many, but one of the more awful to read. And I think it's terribly important for planning to begin now on professionally guided resettlement and rehabilitation for those getting out of the camps, as well as trained medical care to help overcome the consequences of physical and mental abuse. Shin apparently has talked about how he needs to reconnect with his own humanity. Special programs will be needed for women who have suffered from trafficking and sexual violence, and a mechanism will be needed to trace families. There are experiences with camps opening and what has happened, both the Soviet Gulag and also the concentration camps. And there are a lot of lessons learned about what should not be done. And I think it's terribly important to begin to look at what happened before in a situation like this and know what shouldn't be done and what should be done and what should be prepared for. North Korean defectors can play an important role as a bridge in such a transition. I think they should begin to be involved and to be trained and to give training in helping with the transition. Not only have increasing numbers learned to adapt to the capitalist and democratic South, but some are becoming expert in the principles of international human rights. Several defectors have testified before the UN, and they have supported the Commission of Inquiry for crimes against humanity in North Korea. They could help to make human rights education a central part in any transition, since the North Korean people have been so heavily indoctrinated and kept in the dark about their rights and their government's responsibilities. And often you hear, well, the North Koreans don't really know. I think they'll catch on very fast once they're exposed to the outside world. And I also think people have a sense of having been wronged. Now, such educational programs must also extend to the South Korean public so that it gains a greater understanding of the human rights abuses to which North Koreans have been subjected. I think this is essential preparation for transitional justice. There have been too many reports about North Koreans who have defected to the South and who have faced what they say are social prejudices, resentments against them, and they're looked down upon. Addressing these attitudes will need to be a critical part of reconciliation. In closing, let me emphasize that when the North Korean regime falls, we will all probably learn of greater numbers of people held in camps and many other unimaginable atrocities, as historian Bruce Cummings has warned. And that is why this conference is so important in trying to begin to plan and pave the way for a future respectful of human rights in a unified Korea. And this should be a goal that the international community should be expected to get behind. Thank you very much.